Hello everyone and welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream, The Road to 2030, Getting Global Goals Back on Track. I'm Julia Chatterley, anchor and correspondent for CNN International, and we're coming to you live just across the street from the UN headquarters here in New York. A fitting backdrop, I think, for this morning's conversation. Throughout the year, this Global Stage series, presented in partnership with Microsoft, brought you live streams from the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Munich Security Conference, the UN General Assembly, and other gatherings of leaders from the public and private spheres. And the phrase we keep hearing, converging crises, has been a central theme, I think, of 2022. We're going to talk about the damage wrought globally by the confluence of a pandemic, climate change, and a seemingly endless war in Ukraine. But we'll also be discussing how to mitigate that damage as we head into 2023. Over the next hour, you'll hear from some of the world's foremost experts in their fields of political science, public health, and technology, just to name a few. And today, for the first time too, we're joined by a studio audience gathered here at Microsoft's Office of UN Affairs. We like that. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you with us. Let's begin with Brad Smith, President and Vice Chair of Microsoft, Melissa Fleming, UN Under-Secretary General for Global Communications, and of course, Ian Bremmer, Founder and President of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Welcome all, and welcome too to the viewers at home. This series has spent a great deal of time talking about both crisis, but also recovery, I think, and this is vitally important. Where are we on that spectrum between cascading crisis and recovery? Ian, I'll begin with you. No, I roll to begin.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard one. Of course, we're on the spectrum, right? I think we all feel like we're on the spectrum right now. There's a lot of unending crisis going on, and we know that before you get a snapback function, you have to experience a lot of that pain. That's, of course, been true for the pandemic. And yes, we feel like we're coming out of it in the United States and China a lot more rapidly than anyone expected. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Talk about it.
But when we talk about climate change, when we talk about COP process going on in Montreal right now with all the emerging market leaders suddenly walking out, first time you've seen that, that is not the news. It's not the headlines you want of how we're going to fix this. But it is, of course, the requisite antecedent. You don't get there until tempers become great enough that people recognize you need to actually fix something. You need to take it seriously. That's where we are right now.
Yeah, the crisis
there's anger, there's stress, but the crisis is becoming big enough that we're taking it seriously. So there is hope at the end of this tunnel.
We'll talk about the hope too. Brad, your perspective here.
Well, I think it is really the series of crises, Julia, that is the biggest challenge. If you look at COVID, you'd say we have people together in the room today. That looks like the road to recovery. And as you said, even in China, the middle of December looks a lot different from the middle of November. There's still challenges, and we'll talk about them. If that had been the only crisis, we'd probably be feeling better about this decade. I think the real challenge is we entered a second crisis called the war in Ukraine. We've entered a third crisis of sorts called macroeconomic headwinds. And we have the crisis that we began the decade with called climate. And so suddenly you're dealing with four things, not one or two. And I think that is the biggest challenge we face.
Melissa, your perspective here, because on top of that we have, and I know this is something obviously you're very focused on, disinformation, misinformation, which makes tackling a lot of these issues that much harder.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with Brad and Ian on the compounding crises, but also the opportunities that we're seeing, the kind of wake-up calls that, because we've really slid backwards in many directions. I just came out of a crisis meeting with WHO on where we're going with COVID. And, they outlined all the incredible progress, but, if you look at poor and developing countries, the level of vaccination is still incredibly low. And so there's so much more to be done, and yet there's so much lethargy. We're also seeing, people on one hand, kind of energized, depending on who they are, but a whole swath of the public feeling this gloom and doom of all the compounding problems in the world and just not really knowing what to do about it and putting their head under their covers. So this compounded by a toxic information environment that is growing with the kind of proliferation of mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories around all of these topics. I mean, we saw it most prominently with COVID-19 and the crazy conspiracies, but some of those same super spreaders have now shifted to climate, and we're seeing, a spike in climate disinformation. So yes, we're waking up. Yes, there is hope, but there's still a lot to conquer.
Ian, you often talk about this, and actually been talking about it for many years now, and this is a G0 world and a sort of vacuum in leadership in many respects. When we look at either the crises that we've had, do you think the G0 world now that you've long been talking about and that vacuum has been exacerbated the crises, or has it in many ways sort of precipitated them, or both?
There's no question that having a world where the United States is not perceived as playing the leadership role militarily, economically, or even in terms of values creates a vacuum. And that is a vacuum that rogue states will be more powerful in. It's a vacuum where local actors will take advantage and they will seek to advance goals that are not aligned with that of the United Nations or the international community. And it makes us question what the international community even is. But let's again recognize, as we've seen with the news this year, that when it gets bad enough, the international community shows resilience. And for example, NATO today is stronger and larger than it was a year ago because of that crisis. The United States has come together on issues like responding to Russia, responding to China. Just in the last 24 hours, we see the Netherlands and we see Japan supporting the United States on semiconductor policies, precipitating, I think, much more cohesiveness on those values from the entire advanced industrial democratic world. You wouldn't have seen that if you hadn't seen a perception that actually there's a real national security threat that's proximate and growing that we need to do something about. So I can't only focus on G0. As we're seeing these crises emerge, we're seeing that the geopolitical community does have resilience.
That's a perfect lead-in for me to talk to you, Brad, about being one of the 17 UN advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is the key now. We know, I think, and you can talk about this, but that we've got off track, whether it's hunger, inequality, poverty, all the important things that we need to focus on for the medium and the longer term. What's your sense? Because there's sort of sadness in here about where we are today, but there's also hope for this kind of unity playing into those key challenges too.
I think it is sort of a glass half full, a glass half empty at the same time, and you just captured both of them well. If there's one thing that people in business deal with every day, it's this knowledge that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so when I look at the halfway point, and that's where we are for the SDGs, the first thing I would say is, I think we have to get better at measuring where we are. The measurements are way less capable than they need to be at the halfway point. A lot of the data that the United Nations has is not because of the fault of the United Nations, but frankly, the slow pace of governments, it's 2 or 3, or in some cases 5 years old. It's one of these cases where there's probably too many metrics. There's more than 200 in some, by the way you can count it. If we really want to bring the world together to understand what we need to do, I think we need to sort of regroup around that and then have a real conversation. What is achievable between 2023 and 2030? And not just talk about these 17 goals all put together.
A sustainability data and skills gap. You've written about it. We shall get to it, I promise. But ahead of this live stream, let's talk about that measurement. GZERO surveyed social media followers on some of the themes that we're discussing. Here's the first question. As 2023 approaches, I am more optimistic about the future. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or are you unsure? Let me give you a look now at how our respondents viewed the world. 37% agree. I'm adding up the maths quickly there. 63% of people either disagree or unsure about whether they are optimistic about the future. Quick comment on this. We'll expand. Ian? I don't think that's
depends on the day you ask
or
me,
the part
right?
of the world.
I mean, geez, yesterday you see the fusion announcement, you get really excited, right? And then today you see like the Russians responding to the Patriot missile system and you go, ooh, that could be really rough. I mean, there's too much for people to process to answer that question easily.
I know. Audience, very quickly, participation here required. Hands up if you're optimistic about 2023 and the future. This is a very optimistic room. A few nervous-looking faces there. Actually, Ian provided the kicking off point. There are clearly many factors influencing how people feel about the world and the future right now. We're going to dive into 3 of them: conflict, climate change, and COVID. We've already mentioned them, particularly the ongoing impact or the economic impact of the pandemic. But I do want to begin in Ukraine. Ian, 10 months since the beginning. What surprised you about where we are today, whether it's, and you've touched on it already, what's going on in Ukraine or the Western response, perhaps? The level of unity about it.
I mean, one thing that we should recognize is how this could have gone so differently, right? I mean, the unity of the Western response in part came because the Ukrainians were able to hold the Russians off. Every week, it seems we hear about a new, more advanced weapon system that the Ukrainians are going to receive from the United States. Every week, we hear now we're at 9 rounds of sanctions unanimously agreed to by the European Union. Well, remember, when the war first started in February, the Western experts all thought that Ukraine was probably going to fall within a matter of weeks. If that had happened, would we have had 9 rounds of sanctions, or would the Russians largely have gotten away with it? So we do need to understand the path that wasn't taken, but thankfully the Ukrainians were able to stand up, and the West has provided an extraordinary level of support. Where that leaves Russia going forward, of course, is a very challenging and dangerous problem for the world.
The roads that were or weren't taken, the flights also that weren't or could have been taken. You and I discussed this, President Zelensky, Time Person of the Year. Had he taken the flight that he was offered and left the country, you said to me on my show, the outcome would have been very different.
Well, what he said is, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And looking back on Zelensky, that will be the most important quote that he's probably remembered for the rest of his days. But there's no question that the West looked at this and said, we got to protect this guy. Right? There was not a sense of we're going to go in and fight. NATO, we don't want them in NATO. We've been pushing away from that. We're not going to give them all these weapons. And frankly, the technology companies, whether it was Microsoft or whether it was Starlink, I mean, a lot of those companies acted a lot faster to ensure that the Ukrainians could stand up than the governments who weren't so clear on where they were necessarily going to go. And that's important. That's completely new. That's not the way we thought about military conflict 5-10 years ago, but it is for everything going forward.
Brad, again, you were there, we could argue before, really, because you were seeing things even before the physical war began in cyberspace. Talk to me about where we are today, what you're seeing, what you think perhaps the winter months bring as well, and how you're helping Ukraine or continue to help Ukraine prepare and defend.
The thing that I find most important but also sobering is that on the one hand, I think the Russian military has clearly failed in 2022 to use weapons to defeat troops. So instead, they are employing a strategy of trying to use weapons against the civilian population of Ukraine. And they're doing that with kinetic weapons. They're doing it every day to try to destroy the electrical infrastructure. It's as if they're hoping to freeze out 40 million people and force them to flee. We see it with kinetic weapons. We see it with cyber attacks. We see the cyber attacks, at least in October, spread beyond the borders of Ukraine to 6 targets in Poland. Yeah, I do think that the defensive technologies have held at the battlefield. They've held in cyberspace. That's in part because we and lots of others have done so much. We've provided as a company $423 million of technology aid. But I think we just have to be very concerned about the coming months, what it will mean if the Russians continue to try to, say, freeze the population, force the population to flee, use the flight of people to try to create more unrest in, say, neighboring countries, and use their cyber influence operations to undermine public support, which I think is the clear Russian aim at this point, whether you're talking about Poland, Germany, the United States, or elsewhere. So this war is far from over. And the thing that I think we should all worry about the most is this is the opposite of what the world said it wanted for the future in 1949. What they said when they came together for the Fourth Geneva Convention is military force should fight military force and protect civilians. And now we have a war that's the opposite. It is the military against civilians.
Melissa, very quickly, because I can see you nodding, the informational war as well. We can argue a third war here in terms of sentiment and trying to break public spirit, I think, which goes to everything that Brad was just saying there too, whether it's physical, cyber, or otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, on the physical side, I fully agree. The civilians are suffering enormously. Having no power and freezing in a Ukrainian winter is beyond imagination. It goes against all the rules of war. And, the UN itself, our humanitarians are spanning out, delivering generators and blankets and, solar lamps, just some ability for people to survive this winter. But it's really, really distressing to see. On the other hand, we're seeing incredible resilience. And in information brilliance on the part of the Ukrainian government and just keeping people going, keeping their morale alive. At the same time, we are experiencing this information war that you described. It is a huge component of this war in Ukraine.
It also complicates the end game too. I just want to play you a piece of a conversation that we had during the UN General Assembly this fall when we were gathering to talk about many of these same issues. I actually asked the former Croatian President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović what she thought would be Putin's endgame. And it goes to what Ian was saying about the Russian perspective here. Here's what she had to say.
Ukraine cannot concede any of the territories. However, Putin and the current Russian leadership will not just pull away. So what I am afraid we are going to see is a continuation of the fighting. The best thing that we can hope for is some kind of a ceasefire and then give time for peace negotiations. But I don't think that he'll back away from his ambitions to take over Ukraine.
Ian, very quickly here, I think perhaps the danger is, and you and I again have discussed this, is that Putin perhaps comes forward and says, look, here are my ceasefire terms. Ukraine says, no, I'm not accepting him. And suddenly there's a pressure from elsewhere in the world for Ukraine to accept something simply to end the war, the spillover effects, and somehow bring this to an end.
Europeans have been very strong on this and united with the United States. There was concern in some circles in the White House that Macron, for example, might be squishy if there was an announcement of such a ceasefire or a truce, that maybe the Italians, the new Italian government. So far, we've seen none of that. Where we see challenges are with the developing world because of the hypocrisy that they perceive, somewhat rightly, from the West in response to Ukraine compared to other crises in their neighborhoods around the world. We don't have the Chinese with us on this. We don't have the Indians with us on this or other developing countries. That is something that you're going to see on climate, on the pandemic, but it's playing out in Russia and Ukraine right now.
And there are other conflicts in the world, and I want to go to that now. While the world's attention has been on Ukraine, that region is sadly just one of several torn by conflict in recent years, and we have to remember this. Our next guest is an activist from South Africa who focuses on helping children raised in violence and in poverty. Khadija Mayman is a youth advocate for the Forrest Whitaker Peace and Development Initiative. Khadija, welcome. I think we're all aware of the devastating impact on both education, the increased exposure to violence at home, hunger, poverty too of the world's children, particularly in the last 3 years, I think. Talk to us about the children in your community. Where is the need most urgent? And welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I would say that the need specifically to my community would be support for the mental impact or the impact that the violence has on the mental health of young people in my community. And there is just not enough support in that regard. And I think that sets them up for so many issues, other issues down the line, because now you are dealing with a community filled with young people who are angry because they are not receiving enough support for their mental health issues.
You're a youth peacemaker. What does that mean? Because that has provided you some level of training. You have personal experience of what it's like to be a young person in these kind of situations. What are you doing on a daily basis to try and make an impact? And I guess what would your message be to those that perhaps could help, whether it's policymakers, whether it's private companies? What do you want us to understand, and how can others help?
So I, as a youth peacemaker for the Whitaker Peace and Development Initiative, I work in various communities across Cape Town in an area that we refer to as the Cape Flats. And my role is to educate young people on the importance of peace, educating them on the values of peace, which is sometimes a concept that is unknown to many young people in our areas. So that is what my focus is. And I would like to encourage and say to the people who have the capacity, who have the power, that as young people we are pleading with you to provide us with the necessary resources, with support that we need to further or to assist us in the work that we are currently doing. The Vertical Peace and Development Initiative is one organization, but there are so many other young people who are trying to get involved, who are able and who are willing to do the work. We require the support from organizations, from our governments, from businesses. We are saying that we are here, we want to do the work, but we cannot do it without the necessary support and capacity.
You're amazing, by the way. Thank you for what you're doing. You're incredible. And I think everybody listening will feel exactly the same. And I know there's 1,500 of you that are doing this too. And when I look at some of the statistics in South Africa, I think there's a 53% youth unemployment problem. I know you have around 100,000 people that are involved in gangs in particular there. Khadija, just again, from your experience, the kind of things that these young people are going through, and where is the hope? How do we give them hope? And I know you're a crucial part of that.
So with regard to the unemployment, unfortunately, we are trying to create opportunities, but we're also trying to encourage people to, instead of waiting for a business to employ you, let's try and create businesses within our communities that are there to service the community, but are also creating opportunities for others within the community. And we are able to do that with WPDI because we support so many businesses in Cape Town specifically. And then just to give you an idea of like you mentioned, the issue of gangsterism and the gang conflict is quite an issue within our areas, because as much as we are trying to create solutions, there's always still just that barrier, because now we have all these but people trying to start businesses, but it's just not safe in the areas, right? And people lose their jobs ultimately because they cannot get to work because it's not safe for them to leave their areas. And those are the type of challenges that we are currently faced with in our communities.
I know. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for highlighting these challenges. It's so important for us to understand. Khadija Majan there. Wow. Let's talk about another crisis, because there's more of them, impacting children in particular. That's climate change. Nearly half of the world's 2.2 billion children live in countries classified as extremely high risk of climate disaster. Last month, the world gathered in Egypt for the UN Climate Conference, COP27, and at a time when attention and resources are stretched by many competing concerns, much of which we've been discussing. Now, ahead of that conference, climate activists globally were already sounding the alarm about the need for immediate action to reduce carbon emissions and ultimately lower the Earth's temperature. Now, ahead of that, GZERO interviewed Inga Anderson, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, on the sidelines of this year's General Assembly, and asked her about Secretary-General Guterres' assessment that the world is at the edge of an abyss on climate change. This is what she had to say.
I think if you ask a poor woman who's pregnant in Pakistan who lives on the road right now, she has fallen off already. I think if you ask people on Pacific Islands whose lands have been lost, they've already fallen off. Or even if you ask people in California whose houses got burnt in a wildfire, they have fallen off. The truth is that we are falling. And the truth is, therefore, that urgent climate action is the only answer. The only answer. But it doesn't work if one country does it alone. Because if I have climate change, you have climate change. We need to do this together, which is why the multilateral way forward is the only way forward. Look, the G20 countries are responsible for 86% of all carbon emissions. They have to lean in. They have to lean in carbon reductions, but they also have to lean in terms of providing financing. And that is what we call for as we head to COP27.
The G20 nations have to lean in. The G20 nations also include some challenging countries that may make their own decisions and take their own actions due to climate change. I'm thinking of China specifically, but if we're not all on board with the same issues and working together, it's compromise, surely. And I can see Brad and Ian looking at each other to see who's gonna take it first. Brad.
Well, I was at COP27 in Egypt a month ago, and then just yesterday was down in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. African Leaders Summit, where more than 40 African leaders were present. And I think you can connect the dots between the last couple of things we've heard. Things are not in good shape. A lot of what the Secretary General has been calling for is not just a focus on mitigation, but on adaptation, because people, especially in the global south, are suffering from whether it's excessive heat or more disruptive weather patterns and the like. I do think that there are both short-term steps that are critical, and the United Nations is, I think, helpfully launching some more of these, including this early warning system to use technology to help people anticipate what they need to do and better protect themselves from it. I think there's a lot more that we need to do to reduce carbon emissions. I think the good news is the private sector around the world is marshaling forces on that. But then let me just come back to every one of these crises does present an opportunity, and Africa probably illustrates that better than anywhere else. Because you still have 600 million people that don't benefit from the greatest invention of the 19th century, electricity. You have 850 million people who don't benefit from one of the most important advances of the 21st century, broadband internet access. But with an electricity strategy, with a broadband strategy, and with, I'll say, a microfinance strategy that uses the power of the internet to connect people to digital banking, you suddenly start to equip people with more opportunity to create jobs, to build businesses, and grow the economy. So we're starting to see that. You see it from the ground up in the inspiring actions of young people, and also from the top down, including from, I think, President Biden yesterday, or even what we did, announcing an initiative to bring 100 million people into the broadband internet in Africa in just the next 24 months. So it's really, I think, using the crisis, all of these crises to push us to do more together.
And individually as well, I think, to your point, because if we look at this as one big issue, then perhaps you don't even know where to start. If you can tackle it specifically with projects like that, then it's all progress. Ian, your view on this?
The technologies are moving, and of course I'm optimistic about that. We see that with the increased investment into renewable sectors. We see that with the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and the Europeans.
Politically named.
And the sure, but and the Europeans then moving to say, yes, okay, we need to do the same thing inside the EU, and the Chinese are investing in their sector too. But these are wealthier economies, and at the same time that's happening, we do not have money being sent by the wealthy economies who have been responsible for overwhelmingly the lion's share for why we're seeing the climate change all over the world right now, to the Pakistans, the Indias, the Bangladeshs, the sub-Saharan African countries that desperately need help. And you saw in the COP27 meetings in Egypt, you saw that there was an effort to put together this loss and damages fund, that they finally agreed in principle, yes, there should be one, because these countries are all facing a lot of concern and danger and damage. It's not just adaptation, it's who's going to pay for the flooding they just had, for a third of Pakistan being underwater. Who's paying for the people being already thrown off the road, as Ingrid just said.
Are you confident about that?
No,
actually? I mean,
it's not happening.
Yeah.
It's not
Please.
happening. The money we're talking about is largely being invested domestically. And when you talk to the big climate advocates that are in the G20 room, what they will say is, we want to invest so much in these technologies, the prices will come down, and that's going to be much more attractive for the developing world. And yes, that is going to eventually get you there, but in the interim, you're going to have billions of people unnecessarily suffering at the hands of what the industrial world has done for generations now. That's unacceptable. That will cause more conflict. That's why we're not getting the support on Russia from these countries. It's a big part of it, right? You're going to see much more of that going forward. We're nowhere close to the kind of global redistribution that is required to respond equitably to climate change issues for the people that are suffering the most as a consequence of it.
Let's get a different perspective here. I want to introduce Hindou, Ibrahim, who is the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. She's also one of the 17 advocates for the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, alongside Brad Smith, of course, too. Welcome to the show. You're an expert in climate migration. Just give us a sense of the scale of the challenges today, whether it's in your own country, Chad, or around the world.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking me in these discussions. I'm calling you actually from Montreal now, where the biodiversity negotiation is working. So the climate change impact for us, it is not anymore the things that we can look at in the TVs or in the reports. Just during the climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, we face a big flooding in Chad. Even in my own families who become homeless, and we have 4 generations living in the top of Ada. So the climate change impact need to be a global discussion around the world. And I agree there is a big gap between what is deciding in the global north and the global south in order to understand and to respond very quickly. People do not listen. When we tell them we are in the urgency of the climate change, they just think they are very far from it. But they are not far from it. When you have hundreds and hundreds of young people from Africa who just jumping in the sea to go to Europe, they are not going for the economic reason as the past years. They are going because climate is impacting their communities. They are increasing poverty, and food insecurity become a big issue. So they have to look for the alternatives.
You know, it's fascinating, and I couldn't agree more with you. I just don't think we understand the numbers that we're talking about or the importance of specific parts of the world that contribute to this. I mean, you wrote a brilliant op-ed, and I recommend everybody reads it in Project Syndicate, and it's very sort of basic level. You ask for more financial support and secure land rights for Indigenous peoples all over the world. And I think we're really just starting to understand the importance of this. The stewardship of the land, the biodiversity that's contained within it, the statistic that sort of blows my mind away, 80% of global diversity found in Indigenous lands. Just explain that biodiversity, not diversity, biodiversity is contained within these lands. The importance of your stewardship, that stewardship is vital for tackling climate change.
Indigenous peoples are the guardians of the ecosystems. We live in a very rich and protected areas around the world ever. Not protected areas as governments are doing it, but protected by our ancestors that we have the legacy to continue these protections. From the oceans, where you have Indigenous peoples around all the Pacifics and Caribbeans, to all the tropical forests in Amazon, Congo Basin, or Indonesia, to all the mountains from the Siberias, you can pass also to all the Asia, and to the glaciers, you can find Indigenous peoples are in a very rich areas. That's what make us the guardian of the ecosystem, and that's what make we are protecting 80% of the remaining biodiversity around the world. So we cannot sustain and protect this biodiversity if we do not recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples to their land tenure. And that leads us to immediately, we cannot talk about those without having a direct access finance. Let me tell you how. The global north, just like say, they are going to give the finance of 1.7 billion for Indigenous-led solutions. 19% of this money already given. Only 7% from this money went to the Indigenous peoples. Are we serious? We say it is for Indigenous peoples, and only 7%. When we ask them, they say, you need more capacity. We wanted to understand which capacity that we are lacking. If we are able to protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, that means we have a lot of capacity and a lot of skill. So it's just like not the capacity that they think about it. That's why I drive this direct access funding for Indigenous peoples with our own principles. So we are not anymore donor country and beneficiaries and recipients. We are all partners. They are financial partners. They make the richness through the ecological debt. It is now to pay it back to the ecological CEO. So we are the chief ecological officers as they are the chief executive officer. So we are the same as partners so the funding can go to us directly,
I know.
and we can decide it our way.
I hear you loud and clear. I mean, I felt like COP26 was a turning point when that $1.7 billion was pledged, but you're highlighting the challenges and doing so incredibly powerfully. Stay right there for a second, because ahead of this live stream, GZERO asked social media once again this question: climate change will directly impact my life and well-being. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or are you unsure? And this is how people voted. 75% agree. 15% disagree, 10% are unsure. So 75% of the respondents are now saying, okay, I get it. Climate change is going to impact my life. Hindou, very quickly, your response to that. People do get that it's impacting their lives. I think your point is people have to understand that what you're feeling perhaps in your country is nowhere near as bad as people in other countries are fearing. And there are people that can protect the environment perhaps better, and we need to help them.
You are sitting with the Microsoft people. I think all of them there, their life is impacted, because when your business is impacted, your life is impacted. When there is inflation, because of lack of the productivity of the food, your life is impacted. When there is no economy that are ruling, there is conflict around the world, you have to tackle it, your life is impacted. It is not that you get flood or drought that you say, I am impacted. But when the other people's life, economy, and other people's environmental is impacted, so of course it's going to be the impact for everyone from developed and developing world.
Yeah. It's a global problem. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much, Hindou, Ibrahim there. Guys, Brad, I have to come to you on that. You were referred to.
Well, I do think it's impacting everybody.
Yeah.
And it's actually encouraging to see that more and more people
get it.
that.
Yeah.
The other point that I think was really important is, I think including at places like the UN General Assembly, it's really good to go from a conversation that still is important, is the North providing enough money to the South? The answer is clearly no. But the second part of the conversation is, how do you spend money well?
Right.
That was the basic point that was made.
Project-based.
And because I sometimes worry that we never get past the lack of money to talk about how to use money effectively. And unfortunately, one of the things that everybody eventually learns is it's really easy to spend money badly. And once it's spent, if you haven't accomplished much, you're just back to where you began. And so I think that is a rich conversation. And this is where you get these voices that add a dose of reality. That's one of the things that's great about the SDG advocates, in my view.
Yeah, Ian?
Reality, yes. And the language that we use reflects our worldview. We talk about donor countries, and yet the donor countries for biodiversity are not the advanced industrial economies. They're Chad, they're developing world. The donor economies for resources around the world have been the poorest countries. They're the developing countries. The West has been the extractive economies. And so the idea that we now present ourselves as the donor economies that are writing checks for these people that are, can't take care of themselves is such an offense to the majority of the now 8 billion people on this planet. This is why we created the United Nations a few generations ago. We did that. We should be proud of that, but we need to actually walk that talk. We're not doing it. And we can't, if you're not using the right language, it allows you to lie to yourself. It allows you to believe that what you're doing is more than enough, right? I feel the frustration coming through.
This is such an important point as we move forward as well. We can't go back to where we were pre-pandemic or pre-explosion of a fuel or a finance crisis that we're experiencing at this moment. We have to do better, I think, when we go back to getting on track with some of these SDG targets. We can't go back to the same world. We have to try and improve it. How? Melissa, very quickly here.
How? Yeah, well, certainly I think we pointed to, on the climate front, the world really cares now. There was a recent Pew poll that came to the exact same conclusion. What are you worried about most? The vast majority said climate, and this was not the result of their poll the year before. I might add that their second biggest concern was mis and disinformation. Yeah. And so this is kind of an area that I'm passionate about. We're seeing a disturbing spike in disinformation around climate change. And in the past years, it's been around kind of distorting and deflecting from the problem. It's returned now to the complete denial narrative. Trending on Twitter the other day was the hashtag climate hoax. Now that might have to do with the fact that they fired all of the curators,
We'll come back to that.
We come back to that, but frankly, if we have an information environment where the science is being distorted or denied, we're also in trouble. It's one aspect that we need to work on, and so we need the voices out there, and we at the UN are trying to promote voices because people listen to people are worried and concerned, and yet there's a concerted effort, and we have evidence that it's also being driven by advertising investments from fossil fuel companies. And that is, we just cannot tolerate that. PR companies that are greenwashing, we need people to be informed, and we need the voices to be out there.
I wanted to move on and talk about the pandemic, but you've mentioned it now, so I have to go there. That's the professional responsibility of going completely rogue on a show. I apologise. Twitter and what we're seeing going on at Twitter. Ian's eyebrows just raised there briefly as well. To your point, and I know now you're working with Google to try and bump up UN data and facts on climate because you're so concerned about misinformation. It's sort of a separate point to what we're seeing with Twitter, but just in terms of getting back on track with SDG goals, trying to cut through noise, hate, disinformation, misinformation. Ian, is that complicating it?
Of course it's complicating it.
Yeah.
The United States has become the most important exporter of tools that destroy democracy. It's not intentional, but it's real. And it's not regulated. It's a sovereign space on these platforms. They're monopoly spaces. You're allowing children to get addicted. The A/B testing that's happening on Twitter and on these social media platforms are not meant to see what's better for the community society. They're meant to see what is more addictive for the product, which are the people that make up these democracies. As long as that is a principal way that people get information, we will see hashtags like climate hoax continuing to trend. That is in no one's interest other than the shareholders of these companies. No one. But because we live in a society where what drives capitalism is frequently the unfettered interests of those shareholders, government has to step in. And citizens have to step in. There's no choice.
Are we seeing that today?
Not
Citizens?
yet.
Yeah,
No.
I would say neither.
No, we're at the beginning of that process.
Possibly in Europe.
Well, there's only one shareholder for Twitter.
I was about to say, it helps if you're a private
I think
company.
the Saudis still own some of it, actually.
Yeah.
They do.
Everybody's selling Tesla stock to finance it. That's a whole nother show. Let's move on, because this actually does tie in terms of threads to the next one as well. And speaking of life-altering events.
You went completely rogue there.
I did.
Yeah.
I like it. It would have been unfathomable a year ago not to begin this program talking about the COVID pandemic. To date, there have been well over 600 million confirmed cases. More than 6 million people have died. Though the World Health Organization estimates, of course, that those numbers are much, much higher. Obviously, for most of us, and it's a relief, the situation has improved and it's even returned to a semblance of normal. And I use the word normal carefully. But while 71% of the global population has received at least one dose of vaccine, that still leaves nearly a third who've not been vaccinated at all. What does that mean for the future of the pandemic and for the economic recovery that many developing nations still desperately need? Is the pandemic over? President Biden said the pandemic is over. Ian.
Corrected himself.
Yeah, he corrected himself. He did. That's right, and that's our lead comms advisor. Very quickly, they walk things back in this White House. That happens,
yes.
And it's better than if they don't.
Once or twice.
It's better than if they don't walk it back, frankly. But look, we're all in this room. We're almost all unmasked. It certainly feels like life has gotten back to normal, and yet I think over the last week we still had 500 people a day on average dying of COVID in the United States. But in the United States, certainly it feels like whatever the new normal is going to be, we're pretty close to it. We all know that the Chinese, 1.4 billion people, have literally just ripped everything off of 2 years of COVID policy. And they didn't do it with much of a plan. They did it because of a quick response to people getting angry. Now that's, on the one hand, that's very inspiring for a dictatorship, that the people can have that kind of impact. On the other hand, the level of people getting sick and dying that don't have adequate vaccines or haven't been vaccinated recently. And there's no natural immunity going on in China right now because no one's actually gotten COVID over the past 3 years. Very dangerous. So what we're going to see over the next few weeks, I think, is indeed, it's historic, but it's deeply problematic.
Without the level of vaccines, without the healthcare infrastructure support, do you think they reverse this? Because the public response then could be perhaps even worse than we saw in the run-up to this.
I don't think they reverse it because Xi Jinping has now made that decision and he's out there making it. But and they're going to certainly try to get vaccines into arms as fast as possible among the over 80 population. They're going to try to roll out Chinese mRNA, which is being tested in Indonesia right now, as fast as possible. They are building out hospitals. They are building out ICU units. The Chinese government, when they put their mind to it, can build very fast, but they've been ignoring this for 2 years. So the fact, it's how fast they've suddenly shifted. No one in this room, no one on this panel, no one in this room a month ago would have believed that China would be in the position that they are presently now in. It's stunning. And you can only do that in an authoritarian state with that kind of control. But
what kind of numbers are we talking about very quickly? And then I'll get somebody else's perspective of how many people have COVID in the next,
it will be the largest, I think it's going to be the largest COVID outbreak in the history of since it started 3 years ago. And the question is purely how many people are going to die. And the numbers, anywhere from a few 100,000 to a few million, how many the Chinese government say have actually died from COVID. Well, you remember what they didn't say in Wuhan in the first few months. Trust but verify, Chinese data is problematic.
Brad, it's been a challenging few years. The role of technology vital, whether it's, we were talking about there, vaccines, what we've seen in terms of giving people access to be able to work from home, the supply chain challenges, the role that data actually has played in relieving some of those, even in desperately challenging situations. What do you think we've learned, and what do you think we can do better?
Well, in a way, what I would say is when you think about the role of technology, whether it's for good or bad, it does sort of fall into three parts. You've got to invent a technology, you've got to distribute the technology, and then you have to have people use the technology. So, think about vaccines. We invented technology on a planetary basis, and especially with a few companies, at an extraordinary rate. The distribution has been uneven. Certainly you have countries in the global south that don't yet have access to vaccines as plentifully as, say, in the global north, and then you have a very unique situation in China. And then, by the way, you have to get people to use the vaccines.
Right.
And what you see is that 71% of the people in the world have had one dose, but we're here in New York where most people have been asked to take 4. And so you always have this gap, and that's where education or information or disinformation comes in, and you have to combat that as well. Now, the flip side of all of this is when you have technology that is clearly used at times intentionally to undermine the progress. And we've certainly seen that from a country like Russia on vaccines. I think the most interesting thing about Russia's steady flow of information on vaccines is it's in 23 languages. And in every language except Russian, they're saying, do not take a vaccine. But if you read Russian, they will tell you, please go get a vaccine. And so we have to combat that as well. And
it's criminal behavior.
Yeah, it gets to this usage point. You've got to persuade people even when you get the opportunity to them.
We've got a graphic, actually. If you guys are able to bring that up, I think we should show that, which shows the level of vaccination across the world. I just want to show you this. The lighter green, of course, shows you the lowest levels, or the sort of yellowy colour shows you the lowest level of vaccination. Sub-Saharan Africa there is speaks for itself, I think, and goes back to all the points we've been discussing about inequality, access, perhaps manufacturing capabilities, and a sort of nationalist response in getting your own people done, in addition, Brad, to what you were saying about some of the hesitancy and the information as well. I want to bring in our final guest now just to get some more perspective on this. Dr. Omnia El-Romney is Youth Envoy for COP27, an SDG champion, and a medical doctor. Welcome to the show. Omnia, you've said, look, we can't tackle the COVID-19 crisis or the climate crisis effectively until we address the root of all injustices. I'm quoting. What does that mean? Help us understand.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I believe the rule of injustice comes down to intergenerational inequity. As was said, as young people, we are the biggest demographic, children and youth. But when we look now at the numbers that are driven by the compounding crisis of COVID-19 and climate change, every minute a child suffers from severe malnutrition and acute stress in 15 countries in Africa. And every 2 minutes globally, every child that dies or loses their life from a waterborne disease. So we can see how with the COVID pandemic, with the environmental degradation, our lives and livelihoods are being impacted disproportionately versus how our voices, perspectives, and the efforts that we lead on the ground are continuously being excluded from both the decision-making spaces when it comes to the design of policies and around global crises such as climate, but also in the private sector. And this is how we need to create a space that is meaningful, that is consistent, that is sustainable for our needs and our demands, and for us to really shape the future that does not kill our dreams, because we right now are running out of time. But we also have the innovative capacity, we have the solutions, we have the persistence, and most importantly, we have the hope to change the narrative, to do better, and not to be seen as the victims or the leaders of tomorrow, but to actually be the change agents of today, driving the necessary urgency, political will, action, collaboration, and most importantly, tangible impacts to the communities that we work with at the front line.
I mean, that's what's so brilliant about you, because not only do you connect the dots on all of these things, but you're also full of hope as well. And to your point, we have the solutions here. We just have to get on with it and tackle them in greater depth. And also raising young people's voices, because to your point, they also have the power to change. They're going to inherit this earth, and also they're feeling an undue share of the burden of the changes that we're seeing here. You're developing a curriculum to be taught at universities, not just in Egypt, but across Africa as well, to help them understand the impact of climate change, but I believe also how they can fight better and raise their voices louder. Just talk to me very briefly about that and what your hopes are for the future of that.
Yes, so this started in 2020 during COVID. And as a young medical doctor, I did not learn about climate change or the pandemics and the relationship of our health with the health of the environment in my own education. But as a doctor, I am the first line responder to the effects of health of climate change on human health. And I've seen that during my work, seeing patients presenting with accelerating rates of asthma because of the rising levels of air pollution, working at the heart of the pandemic during COVID-19, but also seeing mental stress and anxiety because of the worry and the depression due to the ecosystem change that we're seeing. But at the same time, I saw that there is a gap in education, and I did not learn about it in my own university. But I was very lucky, to be honest, because the climate conference took place in my country, in Egypt, and it's such a momentum that helped me. I did a survey across 112 countries looking at specifically medical faculties and health professional education, whether they learn about climate change or not, or if there is a mention. We saw that less than 15% of 2,817 schools had a mention of that. And we wanted to change this. And I started with my own university, and my dean was very supportive that he did not just want to integrate climate change in medical faculties, but across all the faculties of my university, because he understands how multidisciplinary it is and how we can create generations of eco-ethical leaders that understand the relationship between our health, our sustainable development, and the environment and the planet, which sustains us. And right now we have mandated that across all faculties as a mandatory component, a climate change course. And then we are submitted that also to be integrated across all African universities.
It's amazing. It's so amazing. We did a poll earlier. 75% of people understand that they're going to be impacted by climate change. Now we have to connect the dots with public health emergencies. And I know you've said climate change is the #1 for the 21st century. Omnia, brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work. We have one final audience poll to share. GZERO, our social media followers, the following question: where are we globally in the COVID-19 pandemic? Nearing the end? Somewhere in the middle? I don't know. And here is how people responded. I understand if you say I don't know. Nearing the end, 48%, hooray. Somewhere in the middle, 31%, I don't know, 21%. And I feel for you, I agree. Melissa, briefly on this one, please.
Yes, no, I think people want to be at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, and yet, you open the newspapers and see it's still with us and thriving. But it's all about protecting the population with vaccines and getting back to delivering more vaccines to the people who haven't yet even received a single dose, and that is mostly in the poor and developing countries. And WHO is working really hard to push up the vaccine equity. But again, it's linked to all the inequalities in the world. And I think just my last point is, and this is the United Nations communication strategy, it is not just to deliver the gloom and doom news about the state of our world, which we could do every day and all day, because all of the data of human suffering and of climate change and of COVID deaths is terrible, but to offer hope through solutions. There is a blueprint to get out of all of these situations, whether it's the Ukraine war, whether it's COVID-19, or whether it's climate change, and equip people, not just us, and say only the UN has the answers, but some of the young people who we've surveyed with things that they can do and help to empower them.
I love that. And I wanted to have a discussion about what we need to be and what we can be optimistic about in 2023. So we should go there now. And you can weave into your answer the how part of that. We do have the solutions. We have energy. We have young people who are desperate to tackle some of these challenges, businesses that are doing great things, governments that are taking action. What can we be optimistic about in 2023? Brad?
Well, I guess I would look forward to 2023, and I'll have a mixture of optimism and maybe concern. Look, I think the first thing we have to do is sustain the successes of 2022. That means defending Ukraine. It means continuing, even if each step feels incremental, to expand the supply of renewable energy, to reduce carbon emissions. It means spreading vaccines. I mean, there are more vaccines distributed each year. We're just not going fast enough. I think we can look at some new technology advances that can bring some great promises in 2023. My guess is a year from now, we're going to be talking more about artificial intelligence and its real-world impact on some of these problems than we are today. And at the same time, we have to stay focused on problems that could get worse, whether it's a war that spreads, energy shortages that become more severe, or just food insecurity, especially on a continent like Africa. Ian will undoubtedly inform us all the next few weeks, because he always does such a good job of looking to the new year. And it's never all good. It's never all bad. It's always a combination.
The thing that I'm most optimistic about for 2023 is the resilience of our institutions. Facing all of these crises as we are presently, what we're not seeing happening is the implosion of the institutions that we rely on to actually service, deliver, coordinate. They may not be working as efficiently, they may not have the leadership we want. The institutions are actually remarkably solid. And that's true whether we're talking about the United Nations or the IMF or the WTO or NATO on the global stage. It's also true when we talk about American democracy and Brazilian democracy and EU democracy. And so many people over the past few years says, it's the end. And it turns out that's also fake news. It's a lot of disinformation. So let's recognize that there's some strength there.
Yes. Melissa, final word.
Say one word, multilateralism. I think it is regaining its image as, absolutely essential to solve all of the conflicts and all of the problems that we've just addressed today.
Are we building a better world? Can we build a better world? Is that the aim here?
I hope so.
Yeah, but not the old normal, a new normal and a better normal.
And I do think as we get to the end of December, 2022 was a better year for democracy than we might have predicted in January.
No question. And a year that feels more like it's ready for the 21st century as opposed to looking back to the 20th. That's important too. Democracy is not going to be the same in the 21st century as it was before. And if we're not willing to actually experiment, it's going to fail. We're increasingly willing to experiment.
I'd love to go rogue here, but I'm not going to. I want to be invited back, so I will just thank you, Brad Smith, Melissa Fleming, and Ian Bremmer, of course, there. Thank you so much all for your important and vital insight and discussion. Thank you to our studio audience as well. It was great to have you with us, and thank you, too, for watching wherever you are around the world. To see more programs like this, head to gzeromedia.com/global stage, and the next live stream of this series comes to you in January as the Global Stage team heads to Davos for the 2023 World Economic Forum. Wow, it came around again that fast. I'm Julia Chatterley. For all of us here, thank you for watching, and very happy holidays to you and all those you love. Thank you. I'm gonna clap my audience.